Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Frank and Joe have an idea that their missing chums, Chet, Morton, and Biff Hooper, may have gone out to Blacksnake Island and run into trouble. So they head out to the island in their boat, Sleuth. Yes, there certainly is trouble on the island, and it doesn't just come from the venomous blacksnakes that frequent the place. There are dangerous caves and unscrupulous outlaws as well. Can Frank and Joe do anything to save their friends? To find out, sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in The Missing Chums. Chapter 11. The Island. Joe Hardy started violently. Then, realizing that he had been trapped, he dropped flat on the deck, wriggling to one side, wrestling himself free of the clutching hand. He heard the man who had seized him give an angry grunt. Then he saw the man lunging at him from the shadows. He dodged the outstretched arm and rolled over and over on the deck. "Grab him, Mike!" roared another voice from nearby. And then Joe was dimly aware that another struggle had started near the rail. He leaped to his feet and raced along the deck, the sailor in pursuit. "Over the side, Joe!" shouted a voice that he recognized as being that of his brother. He fled, hearing the pounding of feet on the deck close behind him. A dark figure stepped out of the shadows immediately ahead. "Collar him!" roared the man at his back. The dark figure advanced with outstretched arms. Joe stepped neatly aside, dodged as the man swooped at him, and blundered to the left. The two men collided violently, and by the time they had disengaged themselves, Joe was a good 5 yards away. The schooner was in an uproar. A revolver roared from the shadows, and the darkness was cleft by a crimson splash. "Harbor thieves!" yelled a voice from behind. "Catch 'em!" Footsteps pounded on the deck. Shouts and muttered imprecations rang out. A light flared from somewhere ahead. Out of the shadows rose a man who lunged fiercely at Joe, grappled with him, and they fell to the deck together. Joe managed to wrench himself free and rolled to one side, scrambling to his feet. He heard a splash nearby and a shout, "Over the side!" He could hear Frank calling again. His brother's voice was far below, and he knew that Frank must have dived from the rail. He was not far from the side of the schooner, and he raced for the rail, just as half a dozen figures came plunging out of the gloom, their heavy boots thudding tremendously on the deck. Again the revolver crashed out, and again the tongue of crimson flame licked its way through the blackness. The bullet passed within a few inches of Joe's head, and he ducked instinctively. He reached the rail. Desperately he scrambled up, but just as he poised for the dive, a great hand closed about his ankle, and someone seized the back of his coat. He felt himself dragged back, but with his free foot he kicked out. The grasp of his pursuer relaxed, and Joe heard him grunt from the impact. The man staggered back. The moment he was free, Joe went over the side. He struck the cold water of the bay with a splash and went far down into the depths. Then he found himself rising again, and at last he bobbed up over the surface. He did not know where the motorboat was, but he swam ahead, at the same time keeping a wary eye above. He could see dark figures silhouetted above the side of the vessel, and he could hear voices. "He's down there," declared a gruff voice. "I almost had him," shouted another. "I grabbed him just as he was going over, but he kicked me in the jaw." "How many were there?" asked another sailor. "2. declared the gruff voice. "Harbor thieves, both of 'em. Come sneaking aboard, one at a time. I caught one of 'em peeping down into the galley where the cabin boy was peeling potatoes, and I followed him till he went back to the side. So I figured he had the rest of his pals down below. I grabbed him and clapped my hand over his mouth and made him wave for him to come up. But there was only one come up, and Bill here grabbed him, but he got away." "Both of 'em got away? Yeah, I hope they drown." Then a thrill of fear ran through Joe as he heard one of the men say, "Keep quiet. Listen, don't you hear someone swimming down there?" The voices died down. Joe could see the figures leaning over the side as the sailors intently peered down into the darkness. He ceased swimming to tread water quietly. "Take a shot at him," advised someone. Joe let himself sink beneath the surface, and hardly had he gone beneath the waves than he heard the muffled report of a revolver and a splash nearby. He swam beneath the water until his lungs were almost bursting. Then, when he could stand it no longer, he came to the surface again. He was deep in the shadow of the ship, and he had left the sailors behind, still watching the place where he had gone down. "I don't believe there was anyone there," muttered one of the men in a disappointed tone. "No, I guess they both got away," agreed another. "We scared 'em off anyway." "Did they steal anything?" "No, they didn't have time. I nailed the first one before he'd been on the ship long. I guess he just went on ahead to see if everything was clear." I'm going to bed, as long as we scared 'em off." The voices died away. Relieved, Joe swam on. In a few minutes he caught sight of a dark shape ahead. It was the motorboat. Silently he swam toward it until he had reached the side. A voice whispered, "Is that you, Joe?" "Yes." Frank had already gained the boat. He now leaned over the side and grasped Joe's hand, helping his brother on board. Dripping wet, they both crouched in the boat. "Lucky they didn't see the Sleuth tied down here," whispered Frank. "I've been waiting here for you. I thought sure they had you." "It was a close call. They mistook us for harbor thieves, eh?" "Yes." "Did you see Chet?" "It wasn't Chet after all." "No?" "It was the cabin boy. I peeped into the galley, and there he was, peeling potatoes. But it was another fellow altogether. He looked like Chet, so I started back, and I had just reached the side when a sailor grabbed me. He kept his hand over my mouth so I couldn't call out. Then he grabbed my arm and made me wave over the side. I thought you were motioning for me to come on up." "It was a bad mess. Oh well, we're out of it. If we can only get away from here quick enough. I think we'd better wait for a while until the excitement dies down." The boys waited in the darkness. Gradually, the schooner became silent once more. The sailors had evidently returned to the forecastle. At length, Frank judged that they could escape without trouble. Fortunately, the engine of the motorboat responded immediately, and although the noise of their departure was sufficient to arouse the ship, the Sleuth shot away into the gloom so swiftly that their escape was assured. When they were several hundred yards away, they looked back and they could see the lights of lanterns moving about near the stern. But they knew that the sailors would not put out after them. Even if they had, the motorboat would not be overtaken. They were afraid that the men on the schooner might have given word to the harbor police to be on the lookout for them. But, as Frank said, their consciences were clear, and they had no doubt of their ability to explain the situation satisfactorily. However, they were not intercepted, and, in Rock Harbor, they tied the motorboat up for the night, going to a nearby hotel, where a sleepy night clerk assigned them to a room. Early next morning they were away again. "Blacksnake Island isn't far away now," said Frank. "We should be there in a few hours at the most." There was no sign of the other boys, but Frank and Joe decided that they would not wait, as the others would overtake them at the island, or would meet them on their return. They had replenished their boat with oil and gasoline. They had again inspected their supply of provisions, and were in every way in readiness for the last lap of their search. It was mid-morning before they came within sight of Blacksnake Island. It lay not far from the coast. A low, lean, sinister stretch of swampy land, terminating in rocky bluffs on the seaward side. There was a dank, heavy growth of vegetation, and the island seemed to steam in the summer heat. "Ugly-looking place, isn't it?" remarked Frank, as the motorboat sped on its way. The craft grew closer to the island. There was no sign of life. As they came nearer, the boys could distinguish the fetid swampland facing the coast, the still silent trees that seemed to droop beneath the scorching sun, and they felt a qualm of repulsion. Blacksnake Island was not an inviting place. It lived up to its name. It was a fit abode for serpents, not for human beings. When they were within half a mile of the island, they heard a vague but familiar sound. "Motorboat!" exclaimed Frank. They listened. They could hear the sound of a motorboat, apparently approaching from the far side of the island. Frank spun the wheel. "We'll head down the channel. No use letting him think we're bound for the island," he said. "It's not likely to have anything to do with our search, but it's best to play safe." The Sleuth changed its course, so that Blacksnake Island was now to one side, and the motorboat appeared to be heading on down the coast. The Hardy Boys scanned the dark bank of land intently. The other boat appeared in view at last. It emerged slowly around the lower point, poking its nose inquisitively out into the channel, as though to assure itself that the way was clear. Then it picked up speed and came surging out toward the mainland. At that distance, Frank and Joe could not readily distinguish the features of the men in the craft, but they saw that there were two of them. Frank's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the boat. "Seems to me I've seen it before," he remarked, picking up the binoculars. He raised them to his eyes and gazed long and earnestly at the speeding craft. Finally, he handed the glasses to Joe. "What do you think?" he asked. "Why, of course we've seen it before!" Joe exclaimed after a brief inspection. "We saw that boat in Barmet Bay." Frank nodded. "It's the same motorboat that chased us the afternoon of the storm." Chapter 12. Into the Cave. Frank Hardy bent over the wheel. "I'm going closer," he said. "We'll make absolutely sure of this." He altered the course of the boat so that it would intercept the other craft at the speed they were going. Then he turned up his coat collar and drew his cap lower over his eyes. "If it's the same boat, and if the same men are in it, we should be safe enough as long as they don't recognize us. They saw us that day, but they've never seen the Sleuth. We'll get as close to them as we can." But the other craft had increased its speed. It was a powerful boat, and a high curl of foam now rose from its bows as it plunged through the waves in a rapid flight toward the mainland in the distance. The roar of the engine was borne to the boys' ears on the breeze. "We're going to lose 'em," muttered Frank. "They're too far ahead of us, unless we want to cut in and meet them right near the land. That will only make them suspicious. Yes, I guess we better let 'em go." Still, he did not give up the attempt just then, opening the throttle so that the Sleuth was racing along at its top speed. But the other boat had the advantage and cut across their course with a quarter of a mile to spare. Joe gazed through the binoculars, striving to identify the two men. "No use," he remarked at last. "The fellow at the wheel is turned away from us, and the other man's bending down in the boat so I can't see his face. Is it the same boat? I can't be positive, but I think so. It certainly looks very much like it. I'm almost sure. Of course, there might be lots of other motorboats just like it, but I've got a hunch that it's the same craft. What would it be doing at Blacksnake Island? There's no doubt that it came from there." "That's for us to find out. We'll let them go onto the mainland, then we'll circle back and go up the other side of the island." In a short time, the other craft disappeared from view, entering a small cove some distance down the coast, and Frank turned their boat about and headed toward Blacksnake Island again. They approached it from the seaward side and drew in as close to the island as they dared. The rocky bluffs were lonely and forbidding, seeming to offer no available landing place. "We'll go right around it. If Chet and Biff are there, we should be able to see their boat, or a fire, or some sign of them," said Frank, half questioningly to his brother. "After seeing that other motorboat, I'm pretty sure we won't see any sign of them at all. I'm pretty well satisfied that those men kidnapped them and brought them here. And if they did, you may be sure they'll be well hidden. We'll search the island anyway, but if we don't see anything, we'll land and make a search of the place." But making a circuit of the island took longer than the boys expected. Blacksnake Island was bigger than it had first appeared. It was almost a mile in length and correspondingly wide, a great swampy tract of forbidding swamp at one end, rising to higher ground and desolate rocks at the other. On the swampy side, there were sinister little creeks, dead bushes half inundated, logs floating about in the black water. Frank and Joe caught glimpses of triangular black heads forging slowly through the water here and there. "The blacksnakes!" Frank exclaimed. Once the motorboat passed within a few yards of one of these black reptiles. Fascinated, the boys watched the ugly black head that projected above the surface, and they could see the long, sinuous body writhing beneath the water as the snake swam toward the fetid marsh. "There must be hundreds of them on that island. They're dangerous, too. I've read about them. A bite from one of them means you're finished." There were fewer snakes on the rocky side of the island, and after they had made the circuit without seeing any sign of human life, the boys decided to make a landing. "Seeing that motorboat leaving here makes me believe someone is around," declared Frank. "I won't be satisfied until I find out for sure." "We won't stay here all night." "It all depends. If we're satisfied that the island is deserted, we'll leave. But if we think we haven't searched thoroughly enough, we'll stay and hunt around again tomorrow. It'll take a few hours to give the place a thorough going over." "How about the snakes? Won't it be dangerous staying here all night?" "Oh, we'll find some place where they can't get at us. If the worst comes to the worst, we can anchor the boat and stay in it." This decided, after some search they discovered a small cove, well protected from the sea, that appeared to offer a good landing point. The cove had a narrow entrance between the rocks, but widened out into a small lagoon, with water deep enough to enable the boys to bring their boat up close to a wide shelf of rock. They anchored the Sleuth, then clambered up onto the rock. "Feels good to stand on solid footing again," Joe commented. "I'll say it does. Well, let's be starting. Which way should we go? Is it to be north or south?" "It doesn't matter much. To start with, we'll nose around among those rocks for a while." The sun blazed on the bare crags as the boys picked their way over the rocks and boulders. Away in the interior, they could see the waving tops of trees in the steaming marsh. But for the time being, they contented themselves with exploring the rocky end of the island. It was quite barren, and it appeared that no human being had ever set foot upon the place. "You can't blame 'em either," said Frank, when Joe had remarked on this fact. "It's certainly not a place where I'd care to build my happy home." After about an hour of desultory search, they came upon something that proved conclusively that human beings had indeed been there before them, and not long previously at that. Charred embers and a crude fireplace built of rocks in a little hollow told the boys that someone had preceded them. "We're on the track of something," declared Frank, as he examined the remains of the fire. "This blaze was built here not long ago. Someone has camped here." He circled the rock, which dipped toward a patch of undergrowth and luxuriant grass. "And here's a trail!" he exclaimed. It was merely a faint depression in the deep grass, but it proved that more than one person had passed that way before. The trail wound along through the verdure, away from the shore, leading toward the interior of the island. "Well, if someone else has gone this way, we can follow that path too," Joe remarked. "Got your gun?" Yes, Frank patted his hip. Both boys had provided themselves with revolvers before leaving home. They were not adept with firearms, but the nature of their mission had prompted them to come prepared for any emergency. Fenton Hardy had a collection of weapons in his study, all trophies of his various cases, and the Hardy boys had each taken a small and efficient-looking automatic pistol for protection. They struck out along the faint trail, the grass rustling about their feet. The green thicket loomed ominously before them, and the heat became more intense. Frank was striding along in advance, gazing at the thicket ahead, when he suddenly came aware of a disturbance in the grass almost at his feet. Some sixth sense warned him of danger. That strange tickling of the spine, man's instinctive reaction to the presence of a hidden peril, made him look down. Immediately in front of him lay a huge black snake. The reptile was easily 5 feet in length, and as the boy leaped back, he could hear a prolonged hissing. The snake writhed and twisted, and its head came into view from amid the grass, the red tongue flickering wickedly. Frank saw that the snake was coming directly at him. He leaped to one side, at the same time snatching his automatic from his hip pocket. He had not time to aim, but he pressed the trigger and pumped 2 shots in the direction of the reptile. The snake stopped dead, then swiftly began to coil itself up in readiness to strike. Not a word had been spoken. Frank had blundered back against Joe, who was unaware of the cause of his brother's sudden alarm. He quickly grasped the situation, however, and looked about him. Close at hand, almost hidden by the grass, was a heavy stick. He bent and quickly snatched it up. "Quick!" said Frank, taking it from him. He brandished the stick and brought it down with terrific force upon the snake. The first blow did not kill the reptile, although it rendered it helpless. The hissing continued. The scarlet tongue flickered like flame. Then the boy brought the stick down again. It crushed in the evil black head. A few spasmodic wriggles, and the snake lay still. "Whew!" breathed Frank, stepping back. "What a big brute he is!" The boys inspected the reptile more closely, repressing a shiver of repulsion as they saw the sinuous, scaly body lying there in the grass. "We'd better get away from here. Path or no path, where there's one snake, there's more. Its mate is probably close by." The boys retreated until they gained the comparative safety of the rocks. "It's lucky for me you saw that stick," declared Frank. "He was coming right for me, and the automatic wasn't much use. He was moving so quickly I couldn't have shot him. He was stirred up and angry, too. I guess I must have disturbed his morning nap." "We'll stick to the rocks for a while, I guess. It's time enough to go nosing around the interior when we've finished with the outside of the island." The boys descended a rocky slope that led into a small bay protected from the sea by a black reef. There were no snakes in sight as they skirted the shore, and then they came upon a well-beaten path leading up the side of a cliff. "By the look of this path, the island isn't as deserted as it looks," Frank commented. "Perhaps we'll have better luck following it." The path wound around among the rocks, seemingly in an aimless fashion, now diverging toward the shore, now bringing them farther inland. They followed it doggedly, however, convinced that it must have an ending somewhere, and that the termination would give them some clue as to the people who had used the trail before. The trail at length brought them in front of a huge black opening in the rocks. It was a cave, over 12 feet in height, dark, gloomy, and forbidding. "Now what?" asked Joe. Frank glanced at his brother. "Shall we go in?" "You can't scare me. If you'll go, I'll go." "The trail leads here. Other people must have gone in here. If they can do it, so can we." "Lead on." Frank picked up a heavy stick lying among the rocks near the entrance to the cave. "You never know when we'll run into snakes around here," he remarked. "It's just as well to be ready for them." Joe hunted around until he too found a club that would be serviceable in the event of their encountering more of the reptiles. He patted his hip to make sure that the automatic was still in his pocket. "All set?" "All set." Frank stepped forward and entered the mouth of the cave. Joe followed at his heels. For several yards, the cave was illuminated by the light from outside, but as they went on, the gloom became deeper, until at length they were faced by impenetrable darkness. Frank had brought with him a pocket flashlight, and he switched it on. A wide ring of light shone before them, showing the damp rock walls ahead. They stepped forward cautiously. The floor of the cave sloped upward, but the great opening in the rock was of such extent that the ceiling was scarcely visible above, in the light of the flashlight. "I don't know where we're going, but we're on our way," said Frank as they toiled on, up over the rough rocks. His voice awakened tumultuous echoes that were flung back and forth from the massive walls. The flashlight showed him at length a place where the floor dipped abruptly to a steep slope, although there was still a wide ledge at the top, sufficiently wide for them to proceed. He turned the light down the slope, but could see nothing save inky blackness. The boys proceeded slowly along the ledge. There were numerous pebbles and small rocks underfoot. It was difficult to see these, because Frank was obliged to keep the flashlight centered on the trail ahead, and they were obliged to proceed cautiously in order to keep their footing. This circumstance led to disaster. Unwittingly, Frank stepped on a small rock that rolled suddenly beneath his feet. He staggered, stepped on another rock that slipped to one side, and then he sprawled forward, the flashlight spinning from his hand. The light clattered among the rocks ahead, and darkness fell about them. "What's the matter?" asked Joe, alarmed. "It's all right, I just slipped." Frank got to his feet. "I lost the light. It fell down here somewhere. Hang on to the back of my coat, and I'll go ahead and get it." Joe caught at the back of his coat, and Frank slowly felt his way forward in the deep blackness. Suddenly, he lurched ahead, his foot sinking in a treacherous mass of sand and gravel. Wildly, he strove to retain his footing, but the effort was in vain. He felt himself slipping, and he was flung into space. Joe, who had been clinging to Frank's coat, was wrenched to one side. He stepped forward, grasping for his brother. Then he, too, went hurtling into the darkness. They pitched down amid a clattering of rocks and pebbles. Then, with an icy shock, they plunged into a deep pool of water. Chapter 13. The Four Men. Profound darkness enveloped the Hardy Boys. The blackness of the icy pool was no blacker than the darkness of the air above. Frank rose sputtering to the surface, unharmed by his fall, and as he splashed about, his first thought was for his brother. "Joe!" he shouted. "Joe!" There was no answer except from the echoes, and the rocks shouted mockingly back at him, "Joe! Joe! Joe!" growing fainter and fainter until they died away to a mere whisper. Then there was a splashing almost at his side as his brother rose to the surface of the pool and struck out blindly. "Are you all right?" called Frank. "I'm all right," gasped Joe. "Keep beside me. We'll try to find the edge of this pool." Frank swam forward, groping ahead, until at length his fingers touched the smooth rock at the water's edge. But the rock was almost vertical, and it was so smooth and slippery that there was no hope of a handhold. He swam to one side, feeling the rock as he went. Despair seized him as he found that the rock still rose steeply above. If they had fallen into a circular pit, they were doomed. In pitch darkness, then, they battled their way around the border of the pool, until at length Frank's searching fingers closed about a rocky projection that seemed to indicate a change in the surface of the cliff. He was right. There was a small ledge at this point, and he was able to drag himself up onto it. There was room enough for both of them, and he turned and grasped Joe's hand, dragging him up on the rock after him. They crouched there in dripping clothes, breathing heavily after their exertion. Presently, Frank began to grope upward, still examining the surface of the cliff. He found that it sloped gradually, and that the surface was rough, with a number of footholds. "I think we can climb it," he told Joe. "It's mighty dark, but if we can ever get back on the main ledge again, we'll be all right." He said this because he judged that the place they had found was on the side of the pool that lay toward the entrance of the cave. If they had emerged on the other side and had regained the ledge, they would have been in another dilemma, because they might not have been able to cross the treacherous breach in the trail that had proved Frank's downfall. Frank groped his way up the face of the slope. He dug his foot against the first ledge and raised himself, clutching at a projection in the rock above. Then, scrambling for a further foothold, he managed to draw himself up. Here the slope became even more gradual, and by pressing himself close against the rock, he was able to crawl on up, until at length he came to a flat shelf of rock that he recognized as the main ledge that they had followed from the entrance to the cave. "I'm up!" he shouted back to Joe, and then he heard a scraping on the rocks, as his brother also began the ascent. Joe made the climb without difficulty, and in a short time rejoined his brother on the ledge. "I guess we'd better go back," Frank said. "This cave seems to lead to nothing but trouble. We're better off out in the open." "Is the flashlight lost?" "Yes, I think it smashed when it fell against the rocks. Anyway, I'm not going back to look for it in the dark. That ledge was treacherous enough even when we had the light." Step by step, proceeding cautiously, the Hardy Boys made their way back toward the entrance to the cave. Their return journey was not so precarious because the entrance to the cave shone before them as a vague gray light and guided them on their way. They reached the entrance at last and again stepped out into the bright sunlight. At first they were dazzled after the blackness of the cave. "First of all, we're going to dry our clothes," declared Frank, as he hunted around the rocks for sticks that might serve for firewood. "I am soaking wet." "Me too. Thank goodness it's warm out here." "I'm glad I carried the matches in this waterproof case, or we'd have been out of luck." They managed to find enough sticks and dry leaves to enable them to start a fire, and soon they were standing about, in various stages of undress, drying their soaked garments before the blaze. This occupied some time, and it was mid-afternoon before they were able to proceed. They had taken some sandwiches with them from the boat, and they made a lunch of these while their clothes were drying, so that eventually, when they donned their garments again, they were warm, fed, and contented. "Where do we go from here?" inquired Joe. "Anywhere but into caves," his brother replied. "I think we might as well follow along the shore again. One thing is certain, there have been people on this island, and not long ago at that. Why—" Suddenly he stopped. "Listen!" They remained quiet. Frank had heard what seemed to him like a distant shout, and as they listened he heard it again. It was a faint call that echoed among the rocks far ahead of them. The boys looked at one another. Frank pressed his fingers against his lips as a caution to remain silent. Then, from among the rocks above them, they heard another shout, clearer this time, evidently in response to the one that they had first heard. The first shout was again repeated. Then silence fell. "That proves it," said Frank quietly. "There are people on this island. They're calling to each other." "Sounded like that." "We'll head down in the direction of the place that first shout came from. It was someone calling to someone else, back up here among the rocks." They went on in the direction from which the first call had been heard. For over 10 minutes they proceeded carefully among the rocks, until finally Frank caught sight of a curling column of smoke against the sky. "Campfire," he said. To approach this fire, it was necessary for them to change their course and go up through the shrubbery toward higher ground. They moved slowly because they did not want to be seen until they had ascertained whether the strangers were friends or foes, and they were strongly suspicious that it might prove to be the latter. A moving object ahead caught Frank's eye, and he crouched down in the bushes, motioning to Joe. They peeped through the undergrowth, and before them they could see a flat surface of rock, in the center of which a fire had been built. 3 men were about the fire. 2 of these were sprawled in the grass at the verge of the rock, while one was standing beside the fire, stirring the contents of a pot that hung from a tripod above the blaze. It was this man that had first caught Frank's eye. The strangers had not noticed the Hardy Boys' approach. "We'll crawl up closer," whispered Joe. Frank nodded. They began to make their way quietly forward through the bushes. Frank, who was in the lead, kept a wary eye for snakes, and also kept watching the 3 men about the fire. The boys' approach demanded the utmost caution. Foot by foot, they made their way closer to the trio about the blaze, until at last they were so close that they could distinguish what the men were saying. Also, they could distinguish the faces of the speakers. They were the 3 men who had been in the motorboat the day of the storm in Barmouth Bay. Although the boys had expected this, they could scarcely restrain murmurs of astonishment. This proved definitely that the motorboat they had seen that morning was the same motorboat that had followed them in Barmouth Bay. The boys listened. "No answer to that letter yet, is there?" one man was asking. The fellow by the fire shook his head. "No answer yet. Oh, well, we can wait." "We can't wait forever," grumbled the other. "I'm not keen on staying on this confounded island much longer." "There's lots worse places," remarked the man at his side significantly. "What do you mean?" "Jail." "Oh, I suppose so, but I wish this business would get cleared up. I want to get back to the city and have a good time." "We all want to get back, but there's no use rushing things," said the man standing by the fire. "We'll be well paid for our waiting." "Do you think we've made a mistake? I tell you, it's been worrying me. If we've gummed up this job by doing a trick like that, I'll never forgive myself." "Nah, there's no mistake. Don't worry about that," scoffed the man at the fire. "Didn't we look things over mighty careful-like before we started?" "Yes," admitted the other slowly, "but they keep harping on that tune all the time, and I'm beginning to think there may be something in it." "Where's Red?" demanded the 3rd man. "Didn't you call him?" "Yeah, I called him. This is him now. He's coming down from the grove." Suddenly, Frank clutched his brother by the arm and flattened himself against the ground. A footstep had sounded immediately behind them. Twigs crackled. Unobserved, a man had approached to within a few feet back of them, striding silently through the deep grass. The boys remained motionless, wondering if they had been seen. For a breathless second, they lay rigid in the bushes. Then the footsteps passed by within a few inches of Frank's outstretched hand. They heard his deep voice. "When did y'all get back?" "Just a few minutes ago," replied the man at the fire. "We left the boat in the bay. Anything new?" "Nothing new," growled the deep voice. "The prisoners are still safe and sound." One of the other men chuckled. "Have they quieted down yet?" "No," growled the newcomer. "They kicked up a big fuss all the time you were away. Still keep saying we've made a mistake." "Mistake nothing," the man by the fire declared. "There's been no mistake about this job. They can't fool me." Chapter 14. The Storm. The 4 men had dinner about the campfire, and when the meal was over, the man they called Red got up. "May as well go back to the cave," he remarked. "It's cooler than out here."
"It's hot enough to put a man to sleep out on these rocks," said one of the others. "Yeah, let's go on back up to the cave." "I don't like the idea of staying too close to the cave," growled the man who had been by the fire. "If anybody comes around here and should find us, they'll have to look some to find them, as long as we're not near the cave, see?" "Ah, that's all right, Pete," retorted Red. "If anyone comes on this island, we'll know of it in lots of time to clear away from the cave. We may as well keep cool."
There was a grumbled assent from Pete, and then the Hardy Boys heard sounds of receding footsteps as the quartet strode off through the grass. They waited until the men were out of earshot, then peered through the undergrowth. "Shall we follow them?" asked Joe eagerly. "You bet we will. I want to know where this cave is that they're talking about, and I want to know who the prisoners are they mentioned. Do you think it really could be Chet and Biff?" "I'm almost sure it is. Didn't you hear the fellow saying that the prisoners kept insisting that there'd been a mistake? We've figured it out right all along. They captured Chet and Biff in mistake for us." The Hardy Boys began moving through the undergrowth on the trail of the four men. They crouched down and kept to the shelter of the bushes, so that they were able to proceed at a good rate of speed without exposing themselves to view. "If we can only get into the cave and get Chet and Biff free!" exclaimed Joe. "It won't be any too easy. They seem to be guarding them pretty closely. First of all, we've got to be certain that it's them." "I don't think there's any doubt of that. Everything hangs together too well. If we could get them out, we could run for the boat and get them away to the mainland. That's what we'll have to plan on, but the main thing is to find this cave."
"Yes, of course."
The four men in the lead had just entered the outskirts of a small grove toward the center of the island. Frank could just see the head and shoulders of the last man disappearing into the woods. He marked the spot where the fellow had entered the grove, and the Hardy Boys made toward it. They found it comparatively easy to follow the trail, for the others had beaten down the grass and twigs in passing, and in a few minutes they had reached the grove. "Go slow," cautioned Frank, as they entered the shadow of the trees. "They may have seen us crossing the clearing." They listened for a moment. They could hear the crashing of branches and the crackling of twigs, the distant hum of voices, as the quartet continued through the woods, so they went ahead. The wood was steaming hot, and the ground was dank underfoot. The grass was long, and the leaves of the trees drooped of their own weight. Once Frank saw a blacksnake scurrying away through the grass, but none of the serpents molested them. The path the boys followed was beaten down by the feet of the men ahead, and they made easy progress until at length the sight of a clearing ahead warned them to again exercise caution. They crept along through the trees and underbrush until the clearing came fully into view. It was at that part of the interior of the island where the swamp gave way to the rocks, and the grassy clearing led in a gradual slope to a high wall of rock, at the base of which was the mouth of a cave. As the Hardy Boys watched, they could see the four men at the opening. One of the fellows, a tall, dark man, was mopping his brow with a handkerchief, while another, a man with a shock of red hair, was just going into the cavern. The other two had flung themselves down on the rocks in the shadow of some overhanging bushes. "So that's the cave!" exclaimed Frank. "I wonder if Chet and Biff are inside." "Most likely. I wish we could get a little closer." "Too dangerous. They can see anyone coming into the clearing." This was true. The cave had evidently been chosen, not only for its possibilities as a shelter, but for its defensive virtues as well. It was plainly the hangout of the gang. "We'll have our work cut out for us to get in there," muttered Frank. "The place is too much in the open. Our only chance is to wait until some of them go away. We might be able to sneak up closer when they're asleep. We'll try it. The only thing for us to do right now is wait until they're all asleep." The boys settled themselves down in the bushes, prepared for a vigil until nightfall. It was now late in the afternoon, and when Frank glanced up at the sky, he saw that clouds had gathered. The sunshine had gone, for a dense black cloud obscured the sun. The sultry and oppressive heat of the afternoon had evidently foretold a storm. "Looks like rain." "Sure does," agreed Joe, looking up. As though in corroboration, there was an ominous rumble of thunder. The wind had died down. Every leaf, every blade of grass was still. The clouds were massing silently. However, the storm held off, and although the sky was overcast and threatening, twilight fell without rain. Frank and Joe, from their hiding places in the bushes, watched the 4 men moving aimlessly about the cave that afternoon. 2 of them had remained inside the cave for a long time, while the other pair chatted on the rocks outside. Night came at last. From the interior of the cave came the flicker of flames, and the Hardy Boys knew that the gang was making a fire for the night. The heat was still oppressive. Darkness fell without moon or stars. "We'll soon be able to creep up on them now," said Frank. "If we can only get close enough to hear what they're saying. We'll probably be able to make sure if they have Chet and Biff with them." The boys waited until the fire had died down. The 4 men had all disappeared within the cave. "Quiet now," Frank whispered. He began to make his way out of the undergrowth. Joe followed close behind. They crept up toward the entrance to the cave. They were about halfway across the open space when the whole scene about them was suddenly revealed with startling clarity in the livid glow of a flash of lightning. This was followed immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very rocks on which they stood. As though this were but a prelude, rain began to fall, gently at first, and then with increasing force. Other lightning flashes followed. Then the storm broke in all its fury. A gradually rising wind began to rake the treetops, and the swishing of leaves and creaking of limbs could be plainly heard. The dull booming of the waves on the distant shore, the moaning of the wind, the driving spatter of rain, the constant peals of thunder continually rose in volume, and the rain poured furiously from the black skies above. The storm had broken so suddenly that the Hardy Boys were taken aback. Their first impulse was to race for the shelter of the cave, but second thought told them that this would be unwise, for the men in the cave might be aroused by the storm. "We'd better go back to the boat," said Frank, turning about. "It's liable to be wrecked." Joe had almost forgotten about their motorboat. It was on the seaward side of the island, and the storm was coming in from the sea. Although the boat was partly protected by the little cove into which they had brought it, there was every danger that the storm might cast the craft up on the rocks and wreck it. The consequences, in that case, would be grave. They would be unable to escape from Blacksnake Island at all without giving themselves up to the gang. The boys turned and fled back across the rocks. Rain streamed down upon them. Thunder crashed. Lightning flickered, illuminating for brief seconds the tossing trees and the tumbled rocks before them. Joe, during the afternoon, had occupied himself by ascertaining the position of the grove and the cave relative to the little bay in which they had left the motorboat, and he had come to the conclusion that the grove was not far away from the end of the island, and almost in a direct line with the cove. Now, in their mad race toward the shore, he took the lead, heading toward the rocky bluffs. The Hardy Boys stumbled through the grove, keeping somehow to the trail. They were aided by the lightning flashes that gave spasmodic illumination, revealing the soggy leaves, the black branches, the tossing treetops bowed in the wind. The storm had become a din of furious sound. The gale shrieked its way across the island from the booming sea, and the thunder rolled like a battery of cannon, while the rain beat down on the forest in a drumming downpour. The boys were soaked to the skin. They fled toward the shore, keeping their course more by instinct than judgment. And all the time there was the dread thought in their minds that they were lost if the Sleuth should be cast up on the rocks and wrecked. Chapter 15. A Startling Announcement. The Hardy Boys reached the cove in the nick of time. Although the place was protected from the full fury of the sea, the high wind had lashed the waves to such an extent that the boat was pitching and tossing about, in imminent danger of running aground. The beach was sandy, however, and after some maneuvering, the boys were able to run the boat up on the shore, where it was safe enough. The storm by this time was showing some signs of abating, although the rain was still pouring in undiminished vigor. Frank rummaged about in the boat until he located their oilskins, and these they donned, although their clothes were already drenched. "I'd hate to be out at sea on a night like this," shouted Frank, as the lightning revealed the tossing inferno of waves under the black skies. At that moment, a light flashed away out to the right. "A boat!" exclaimed Joe, "heading toward the island." They kept their eyes fixed on the place where they had seen the light. In a few moments, a vivid splash of lightning cut the darkness, and they had a momentary glimpse of a small motorboat tossing about in the black waves. "He'll never make the shore in this storm," said Frank, shaking his head. "Can it be Tony?" "I hardly think so. He wouldn't come close in such a storm." "That's true, too." "I think it's some outsider." "Do you think we can help him?" "I don't think so. He'll probably pile up on the rocks." "Perhaps he's one of the gang." "Huh, that's so," agreed Frank. "I hadn't thought of that. Perhaps he knows where he's going after all. Still, it won't hurt to go down to the shore a bit and see if he makes his landing all right." They went on down the shore in the darkness, picking their way among the rocks, feeling in their faces the salt spray blown in from the sea. The dull booming of the surf and the howling of the wind provided an almost deafening cacophony of sound. Every little while, a lightning flash would reveal the little boat slowly heading in toward the shore. Suddenly, Frank stopped short, grasping his brother by the arm. "I saw a light ahead." "I thought I did too, right on the shore." They waited. In a moment, the light reappeared. It bobbed slowly up and down, and appeared to be moving down toward the beach. "Somebody is going down to meet the boat. It must be one of the gang," declared Frank. The boys went forward more cautiously. The next flash of lightning showed that Frank's assumption was correct. They could see 4 men in oilskins trudging down among the rocks. The man in the lead carried a powerful electric lantern that cast a vivid beam of light upon the rain-washed boulders. They saw that the man in the motorboat was headed toward a small bay that afforded ideal protection from the storm. The entrance was very narrow, and great waves dashed over the rocks with showers of white spray. But the man in the boat guided his craft skillfully into the channel. He was in difficulties for a few moments, but by good steering brought the craft around. Then it shot forward, making the channel neatly, and surged down toward the beach. The men in oilskins were there to meet him. The boat was run up on the sand, and the lone steersman sprang out and splashed through the water. For a few moments the 5 men conferred, standing there on the dark beach, with the wind whipping their oilskins about their legs, the lantern gleaming like a white eye, and the rain pouring down upon them. They looked like 5 sinister birds of prey as they stood there in the storm, and then they turned and began to walk back up over the rocks toward the center of the island. "This must be their landing place," said Frank, "and that must mean they have a good trail from here to the cave." "Let's follow them," suggested Joe. "Just what I was going to say. We know our boat is safe, and we can't get any wetter than we are now." The boys therefore made their way down to the place where the 5 men had been standing. They could see the reflection of the lantern as it bobbed up and down, while the quintet trudged back toward the rocks, and they followed. True enough, there was a well-defined trail among the rocks, and they made easy progress, considering the darkness and the fact that the trail was unknown to them. The height of the storm had passed, and the rain had settled down to a steady downpour. The roar of the thunder had diminished to an occasional distant rumble, and the lightning flashes were less frequent. The wind, too, had died down. The light ahead guided them up the trail, across the rocks, then into the grove again, and in a short time they emerged on the edge of the clearing and could see the dull mass of the granite slope before them. The fire still gleamed, and they could see the 5 men go into the cave, which was brilliantly illuminated for a moment in the light of the lantern, which the first man held so that the others might pass. "We may as well go right up," said Frank. "We've come this far. There isn't any use backing down now." "I'm with you." They crossed the rocks and crept up toward the entrance to the cave. They found tumbled boulders about the opening that afforded good protection, and they were able to make their way up to within a few feet of the cave mouth without danger of being seen. The wind and the rain still created sufficient noise to drown out any sounds that they might have made in their approach. Through an opening in the boulders they peeped into the cave. As they were in darkness, they knew there was little chance that they would be seen by the men within. As for the latter, they were in the full glare of the fire, which one of the men had replenished from a pile of wood nearby. The boys, therefore, could see without being seen. The men were divesting themselves of their oilskins, and one of them, the newcomer, had flung himself down onto a pile of blankets, as though exhausted.
"I tell you, it was a tough trip," he was saying. "I was sure I was going to be wrecked. I couldn't find the passage. If you hadn't come along with the lantern when you did, I'd have been washed up on the rocks, and the boat would have been smashed to pieces." "Well, you're here. That's all there is to it," declared the man they called Red. "You shouldn't have started out when you saw a storm was coming up." "I didn't know it was going to be so bad. Anyway, I thought I'd get here before it broke." "It must have been good news that brought you out here tonight," declared one of the others, sitting down. "I'll say it was good news," said the newcomer. "Mighty good news."
"What is it?" they asked eagerly.
"I've found out why Fenton Hardy didn't pay any attention to that letter."
The boys listened eagerly. At the mention of their father, they knew that all their suspicions had been verified. They waited tensely as the conversation went on.
"Why?" asked Red. "He didn't get it." "Why didn't he get it?"
The newcomer paused and smiled.
"Huh! The reason he didn't get it," he said slowly and triumphantly, "is because we've got him." "Got him?" "We've got Fenton Hardy."
"How? Where? How do you know?" Questions were fired at the newcomer from all parts of the cave. He was enjoying the sensation he had caused. As for the hidden listeners, they experienced only a sickening amazement.
"The gang got him in Chicago last night. I just got word this afternoon. He went out there to catch Baldy, but the boys got wind of it, and they laid a trap for him. He stepped right into it." "Good!" exclaimed the red-headed man, rubbing his hands. "What could be sweeter? We've got Hardy, and we've got his sons."
"By the way, how are they acting?" asked the newcomer.
"Ah, still kicking up a fuss, the young brats," growled the man called Pete. "They say they ain't the Hardy boys at all." "Don't worry about that. Bring him out here."
One of the men got up from beside the fire and disappeared into the rear of the cave. His footsteps died away, and the Hardy boys judged that there must be some sort of inner chamber to the place. In a short time he returned, pushing ahead of him 2 boys. Frank and Joe peered forward, striving to catch a glimpse of the lad's features. With a clanking of chains, the boys emerged into the firelight. They were Chet Morton and Biff Hooper. The lads were handcuffed, and their ankles were bound by a gleaming length of chain, just long enough to enable them to walk. They appeared thin and tired. Their shoulders drooped wearily, and as they stood before the fire, they said nothing.
"Well, hearties," said the red-haired man in a harsh voice, "we have some news for you."
"We've told you before," said Chet. "You've made a mistake. We're not the Hardy Boys." The man named Pete stepped suddenly forward from the shadows and cuffed Chet savagely on the side of the head.
"Shut up," he snarled, and cuffed Biff Hooper as well. "No more of that. We're tired of listening to it. You're the Hardy Boys, all right, and it won't do you no good to deny it."
"You've made a mistake," insisted Chet stubbornly.
"We'll show you how much of a mistake we've made," roared one of the men. "We brought you out here to tell you something. Our men have got your father at last."
"Mr. Hardy?" exclaimed Chet, greatly taken aback.
"Yes, Mr. Hardy," exclaimed Red, mimicking him. "That shot sunk home, didn't it? We've got him, and we've got you, and we'll starve you into making your mother come across with the money we want. If you've been holding out, hoping your father would come for you, it's no good now. We've got him, and we've got you, so you may as well give up."
"There's no use asking us," declared Biff. "We're not the Hardy Boys." Red cuffed him viciously over the ears again. Biff staggered back from the blow.
"Oh, take 'em back and chain 'em up again," Red said in disgust. "Let 'em starve for a while, and they'll come around and tell the truth."
"If I could get loose for about 2 minutes, I'd show you," declared Biff, clenching his fists. But the red-haired man only laughed contemptuously. The Hardy Boys, from their hiding place, saw Pete come forward and drag Chet and Biff back into the darkness at the rear of the cave, their chains clanking as they went. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to read about the Hardy Boys in The Missing Chums. Please let me know what other books you'd like to listen to by sending me an email at kluker@marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.